When most people think of Vikings, they picture ferocious warriors pillaging across Europe, raiding monasteries and carrying treasure. That image is only half the story. The other half has them sailing across the ocean to North America almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. So were Vikings just bloodthirsty barbarians or adventurous explorers? The history of the Vikings is so often misunderstood that it's hard to know where to start. Let's begin with the basics. Who exactly were the Vikings? Well, that S, not quite as simple as it sounds because the word Viking itself doesn't refer to a specific group of people. Instead, it's a word that describes someone who goes on a Viking, which simply means a raid. In fact, the Old Norse term was even broader than that. It referred to any kind of maritime expedition, whether it was for trading, exploration, or, yes, pillaging. So calling a particular group of people Vikings is a bit like calling all British people Normans. It makes sense in some ways, but it's not entirely accurate. But we can't be too pedantic, because there's no denying that Vikings were fierce warriors. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, they lived in Scandinavia, which today includes Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And during this time, they established a reputation as some of the most fearsome fighters in Europe. Their long ships were fast and maneuverable, perfect for both attack and escape. And their tactics were brutal and effective. But if pillaging was such an important part of their culture, why did they explore at all? Well, as we said, going on a Viking didn't necessarily mean going to war. It could also mean going on a trade mission or an exploration. In fact, many scholars argue that the Vikings were explorers first and foremost. You see, by the 700s, the climate in Scandinavia was undergoing significant change. The winters were getting warmer, which meant more land was available for farming and more people were looking to do it. But with more people came competition for resources. So the Vikings began to look elsewhere to make their fortunes. This brings us to the next commonly held belief about Vikings, that they only ever raided and traded with Europeans. But once again, this isn't entirely true. While the Vikings certainly had extensive contact with Europe, they also traded with people much further afield. For example, through their connections with the Muslim world, they knew about the riches of the Byzantine Empire. So when the emperor asked the Vikings to help him fight his enemies in exchange for gold, they jumped at the chance. To the Byzantines, the Vikings looked very exotic with their long, flowing beards, horned helmets, and animal skin tunics. But what's often forgotten is that the Vikings weren't all that different from their European neighbors. They farmed, herded animals, fished, and traded just like anyone else. They even had kings. And although their religion differed from Christianity, it wasn't all that dissimilar to the paganism practiced throughout Europe at the time. So when the Vikings traveled to far-off lands, they were often met with curiosity rather than hostility. After all, too many people in the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe, they must have seemed just as alien as we might find an Amazonian tribe or an Australian Aboriginal today. However, as we said, they were renowned as fierce fighters. And that alone was enough to put people on edge. Take, for example, the Muslim traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met the Vikings at the Volga River in the 900s. He wrote that the Vikings were one of the most vile and disgusting peoples on earth. He found their looks and smell offensive, and he was deeply disturbed by the human sacrifices he witnessed. But he also thought that they were generous, hospitable, and honorable in battle. Overall, he concluded that they were both savage and civilized. In other words, they were complex human beings just like us. And what's more, they were incredibly adventurous. One of the most famous Vikings was an explorer named Sunnivyr the Lucky. That name might seem a bit ironic, considering that Sunnivyr led a number of raids against the British, French, and Scottish monarchs, but he also helped forge diplomatic ties between the English and the Norwegian kings. And he explored far beyond Europe. For example, he was the first European to reach the Caspian Sea. And in 962, he became the first European known to have sailed to Vinland, a Norse word for North America. How exactly he got there is disputed. Some historians claim that he landed in Newfoundland, Canada, while others argue that he reached Greenland. But either way, it's generally accepted that he made it to the New World. In fact, there is evidence that the Vikings had settlements in North America, though we don't know how long they lasted. All that we have to show that the Vikings were here are a few pieces of pottery, some animal bones, and a couple of old buildings. But these discoveries prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were intrepid explorers who dared to venture where no Europeans had gone before. However, the reason that they've become infamous for pillaging rather than exploring is pretty simple. We've just got more records of it. Take England, for example. From 793 to 892, the Lindisfarne Gospels tell of a series of devastating Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon monarchs. As we said, this is often what the Vikings are remembered for, and it's easy to understand why. What's more gruesome than a bunch of bearded barbarians slaughtering monks and stealing their stuff? Not much. But that's not to say that the Vikings were capable of doing good things because they were. For example, around 850 AD, King Horik, the first of Denmark, converted to Christianity, but when his son Sven took the throne, he reverted back to paganism. That might not sound like a big deal now, but at the time, Christianity was spreading rapidly throughout Europe, and for a king to abandon it was a big deal indeed. So Sven's counselors hatched a plan to get him to change his mind. They invited the Scottish monk St. Ansgar to visit the royal court, and it worked. Sven converted to Christianity along with a significant portion of his subjects. This had huge implications for the region because it demonstrated that the Vikings could be won over to Christianity. Soon after, missionaries were sent to every corner of Scandinavia to convert the population. So while the Vikings might have been one of the most feared groups of people in Europe, they were by no means one. They were farmers, explorers, traders, missionaries, kings, and murderers. Basically, they were just like us. They explored new lands and made new friends. They converted 2 new religions and killed each other's sons. In short, they were human. And yet somehow the image of the Viking that has endured through the centuries is that of a merciless. But as we've shown, that's only half the story. Today, the legacy of the Vikings is everywhere. There are Viking museums, TV shows, video games, movies, and even theme parks. And although these are often entertaining, they tend to reinforce the common misperceptions about the Vikings. We think of them as being uncivilized barbarians when in reality they were complex, sophisticated people. They were explorers and traders, farmers and missionaries. Above all else, they were human. Now, of course, this isn't the whole story either. There's still plenty of things we don't know about the Vikings. They were a large, diverse group of people spread out over hundreds of years. So they probably had a lot more going for them than we give them credit for. However, that just shows there's more work to be done by historians, archaeologists, and all of us who want to learn about the past. Only then will we be able to get past the sensationalist stories of pillaging and bloodshed and celebrate the Vikings for what they really were. Real people just like you and me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out our podcast where we bring you all the fascinating history you can fit into a YouTube video. Thanks for watching.